now.
Okay, so thanks for inviting me to speak. I'm very happy to be able to tell you about some of my research. Before I get started with new research, let me tell you about the problem of astronomical cataloging. One thing I like about the problem is it's sort of easy to describe, but difficult to solve. In cataloging, you get a collection of images from telescopes as the input, such as this one on the left here. And the desired output is a table that lists all the different stars and galaxies in those images, along with certain properties that describe the stars and galaxies. Location would be a property that you'd find in any catalog. The apparent brightness or flux would be pretty standard for both stars and galaxies. Then galaxies have a lot of additional properties that characterize their spatial structure. So you could think of describing them as an ellipse, in which case you might think of this as having an angle that's a little bit to the left of vertical. But this is the basic idea. There are extensions to cataloging. In probabilistic cataloging, we might think of having a distribution over these tables. But this is the basic idea, input to output. So it's simple to describe. It turns out, though, it's a very challenging problem to solve for quite a few reasons. One is just the scale of the data. It's immense by any standards. LSST will be 50 petabytes, and future surveys may be even larger, 50 petabytes in terms of the amount of image data that the survey will collect, not the derived products. So very big data by any definition. Additional challenge of cataloging is that many light sources are very close to the detection limit. So for this one up here, it's pretty easy to tell it's a galaxy, and then you can estimate its angle if you think of it as an ellipse pretty accurately. For this one here, it's much more difficult. I think it's probably a galaxy, but we would like to be able to acknowledge the uncertainty of our predictions, not just give a single answer for things that are truly ambiguous. And as telescopes peer deeper into space, there'll be things that were ambiguous will become clear, but there'll be a whole new set of light sources that will be ambiguous. A third challenge, and I've come to see actually this one is the most fundamental of the challenges. There are 4 different challenges I'll present, but I've come to see this as really the essence of the problem. The third challenge is that there are light sources that overlap with each other. And so to tell the brightness of this light source, you sort of need to know the brightness of this one too, and vice versa. So in statistics, we have a lot of different problems that are about IID data, where you have capital N IID examples. In cataloging, that's not really the case. There's really just one sky, so sort of a sample size of 1, and everything needs to be resolved jointly. Additionally, there isn't really labeled data for cataloging. You can get labels that are noisy, but basically it's best to think of it as an unsupervised learning problem in machine learning terminology. Okay, then a fourth challenge is that galaxy shapes, as opposed to stars, galaxies are quite complex. Stars near each other tend to look pretty similar. It's a much more constrained problem. With galaxies, you have just a variety of shapes. There's spirals and ellipses, but they're also irregular galaxies that aren't modeled by any simple parametric structure. And one could even make the claim that even spiral galaxies and elliptical galaxies are not well modeled by simple parametric structures, but certainly irregular galaxies, which can constitute up to 1/4 of galaxies in many surveys. So difficult problem. Today, the status quo is to use software pipelines as opposed to anything probabilistic. These software pipelines operate in stages. Each stage kind of passes on some of its predictions, but ignores a lot of the uncertainty measurements. And so as a result, the pipeline in total doesn't correctly account for all the uncertainty of all the different stages of the pipeline. These pipelines to date don't have a method really about reasoning about overlapping light sources. Overlapping light sources, though, are becoming increasingly common, or blended light sources, as telescopes peer deeper into space. There's going to be more blending. Estimates of up to 68% of galaxies will be blended in LSST. So it's different from earlier surveys like SDSS. Then finally, software pipelines don't have a great way to make use of multiple overlapping exposures. I mean, they can make use of co-addition images, but it's not sort of in a rigorous data efficient type of way. So these are the drawbacks of the status quo. And these are reasons I'm excited about probabilistic approaches to cataloging. A probabilistic approach or a Bayesian approach, at a high level, what does it look like? Well, there's a single statistical model that describes all the different facets of the data. The Unknown variables that we're interested in, which are the different entries of a catalog, are considered to be latent random variables. So not something you observe directly, but things that are observed are informed by the observations that you do have. Finally, you condition on the data that you do have, which in this case are the pixels from astronomical images. And that implies a distribution over the latent random variables in the model. And so if you can solve this inference problem, then you've pretty much solved the cataloging problem if your model is good. So that's at a high level what a Bayesian approach would look like. So in this talk, I will go through 3 different approaches to probabilistic cataloging. The first is called Celeste. And while going through Celeste, I'll talk about both Bayesian modeling as well as variational inference, which is a particular approach to posterior inference that I'm excited about for several reasons. I'll talk about what worked with Celeste and then also what the shortcomings were, and that will motivate the next 2 algorithms. Starnet works just with crowded starfields, but resolves many of the limitations of Celeste. In the process of introducing Starnet, I'll talk about a particular approach to variational inference that I'm quite excited about and I think has been maybe underutilized, called the wake-sleep algorithm. It's a particular approach to variational inference that scales well, makes effective use of simulated data, has a lot of advantages. And I'll talk about results on the M2 globular cluster for Starnet. And then finally, I'll introduce my current work, which is called BLISS, or the Bayesian light source separator. BLISS is Starnet, but with the addition of a galaxy model. So Starnet worked only for crowded starfields, which was a particularly challenging test bed for the algorithm. BLISS adds on a galaxy model so that it can do general purpose deblending and cataloging. And let me say, there'll be time at the end to ask questions, but feel free also to ask questions during the talk if you like. Okay, so first, let me discuss Celeste. This was work I began as a PhD student while I was working with John McAuliffe, who is my PhD advisor. Prabhat was the PI on the project, and we were all new to astronomy at that time. So we began this quite a few years ago. David Schlegel kept us on the rails and taught us a lot about astronomy in the process. For this work, the first thing we did was we'll talk with David and other astronomers to come up with a good generative model of the data. And the model is expressed here as a graphical model. This specifies some of the structure of a joint probability distribution over the latent random variables and the observed random variables. So if you're not familiar with this notation, just know that it's specifying a statistical model, or part of a statistical model anyway. I think you can also sort of follow along by the because of the pictorial nature of it. So in this particular model that we propose for the data, the pixels are observed random variables, and the shading denotes that they're observed. It's the pixel intensity. Each image has m pixels, and there are n different images in our collection. The latent random variables are up top, and there are capital S latent random variables in this model. Each of the different light sources, so from 1 to capital S, each of the different light sources has an indicator variable that says whether it's a star or a galaxy. We think of this as a Bernoulli random variable, which has a particular prior on it that's informed by the data. R sub S is the brightness of the light source, or the flux of the light source in a particular reference band. C sub S is a vector of all the colors. And again, there's a prior over the colors. And the prior is conditioned on whether the light source is a star or a galaxy. Since stars and galaxies, stars tend to be brighter, so they have a different brightness, and their colors are also different. We additionally have locations, which we think of it as random, and then also various properties of galaxies that describe their spatial extent. So this is a high-level view of the statistical model that we proposed at first to model images. And one thing that you can do with a model, just to sort of check that your model is any good, is you can look at a real astronomical image, and you can condition on the catalog generated by some other tool, so the SDSS catalog in this case, and then generate a synthetic image from the statistical model. So this is a draw of a conditional distribution. And you can see that the image to the right looks pretty much like the image to the left. We're missing some artifacts where pixels were masked out. There are no cosmic rays in the image to the right, but we've got the basics down. The galaxies in one look like the other. Certain very bright stars are masked out in this case, but the statistical model, I guess, passes a sanity check of sorts by matching. Usually, though, with the statistical model, we don't want to just draw synthetic images. The goal is to do some inference, to build catalogs from images, not just to generate other hypothetical astronomical images. So after passing the sanity check, we move on to perform posterior inference, which is the process of backing up the catalog, given the model and given some data. It helps to have a little bit of notation for this part, so I can describe what the posterior is. The model we described has a bunch of different latent random variables. I said A sub s was this Bernoulli random variable for each light source that indicates whether a particular light source is a star or galaxy, and the colors and so forth. Well, it's handy to bundle them all together to simplify the notation. So just say all the latent random variables in this model for all the different capital S light sources, let's call them all Z. Just refer to them all as Z. And then the data, well, there were M pixels per image, and we had capital N images. Let's bundle them all together and call all the data X. Okay, then with this new notation, the quantity of interest, the posterior, is the probability of Z given X. So easy to describe, but it can be tricky to reason about the posterior, even though it's defined mathematically now. It takes a little bit of work to get at the posterior, given the data. I'll compare variational inference to a more common approach called MCMC subsequently, but let me first tell you about variational inference, which is the approach that I take in these three works. In variational inference, we approximate the posterior rather than recovering it exactly, because recovering it exactly is intractable. In particular, we try to find the distribution from a class of distributions that is closest to the true posterior, or the exact posterior, I should say, exact posterior in terms of this KL divergence. So KL divergence, it's not exactly a distance metric, but it acts like a distance metric. We restrict ourselves, though, to thinking, to approximating this distribution with just a certain class of distributions that makes this optimization problem tractable. So for example, you could make capital Q. So each of these points is a different distribution. This is our target distribution. You could make capital Q, for instance, the family of multivariate normal distributions, in which case every point of Q is just indexed by the real valued parameters, the mean and the covariance. We typically make Q more flexible than just multivariate normals. If you were to just use multivariate normals, you might as well, you would have to take Laplace approximation seriously in that case. We have discrete random variables, so Laplace approximation doesn't make sense. But this is still the basic lay of the land, is that we have some restrictive class of distributions, and we try to find the one that most closely matches the posterior distribution. And the more flexible we make Q, the closer we'll come to the actual distribution. So a lot of work in variational inference now is to come up with more expressive families Q that let us more accurately approximate distributions. The optimization problem that I've shown here pictorially can also be written symbolically. And so I've said the challenge in variational inference is to find this Q star, this distribution right here that minimizes this KL divergence. And it's sort of amazing that it works, right? Because you cannot even compute one of the two terms in this KL divergence. The right-hand side here is the posterior distribution, which is intractable. Nonetheless, some clever cancellation happens with this particular choice of divergence metric, so that you in fact can solve it. The trick kind of happens. So on line 1, I've just written down the optimization problem. To go from 1 to 2, I'm just using the definition of KL divergence. And I've given the expectations here a subscript because there are multiple distributions floating around. It's helpful to indicate which distribution the expectation is taken with respect to. Q is the approximating distribution, the distribution that approximates the posterior. To go from lines, so 1 to 2 is just the definition of KL divergence. To go from 2 to 3, I used just rules of probability. I rewrote the probability of Z given X, this conditional probability, as the joint divided by the marginal. P of X, Z is the joint, and then P of X is the marginal. And then I distributed the log term between them. And then I dropped the expectation from the last term because this is constant with respect to the draws of Q. So far in lines 1, 2, and 3, the objective function has remained the same at each step. And so therefore, the minimizer is also the same. Well, when I go from 3 to 4, the objective function changes, but the minimizer stays the same. And so that's why equality still holds. When I go from 3 to 4, and this is where the magic happens, because in line 3, we're still left with something intractable. Just as we couldn't compute this posterior distribution, that's why we entered into this whole business in the first place. We also cannot compute the marginal probability of the data. And that's true, by the way, in most probabilistic models. There's just a few exceptions where this is tractable, like if everything's Gaussian or everything's discrete. But for most models of interest, both of these two quantities are not going to be tractable. To go from 3 to 4, we simply just drop the last term. And that's because this last term here, log p of x, is constant with respect to what we're minimizing. So we're minimizing our choice of approximating distributions, and this last term, is constant with respect to that. And so that's the magic of variational inference is from lines 3 to 4. 4 to 5, I'm just rewriting. I'm just moving things around to be in a slightly different form that some people might prefer. But 3 to 4 is really where the trick happens. It's just dropping this constant term. In 5, I just rewrote it in a form that might be more appealing as maximizing the complete log likelihood subject to an entropic regularizer. So perhaps you like that interpretation. The most important part, though, between 1 and 5 is that we now have something tractable, whereas we had something intractable at first. Okay, so VI is an alternative to MCMC, which I used to say is much more popular than VI. VI is really emerging. There's a surge in popularity in VI lately, but historically, MCMC was quite a bit more popular than variational inference. The advantages of variational inference are that it's potentially orders of magnitude faster than MCMC. I mean, VI turns this problem of finding a distribution into a numerical optimization problem. And there are a lot of tools out there to solve numerical optimization problems. And so potentially we can avoid having to take a lot of samples. We can avoid having to run MCMC chains out for 1 million samples. Instead, perhaps we can do 50 iterations of Newton's method and find a solution to machine tolerance. Each of those iterations will take time comparable to 1 iteration of MCMC. Whereas with MCMC, you might do 10,000, 100,000 iterations just to burn in before you even start collecting samples. Another advantage of VI is that there are no dependent samples. So in Markov Monte Carlo, the samples, a chain that doesn't mix well will have samples that are highly dependent on the previous samples. In general, it's just hard to say whether a chain is mixing well or not. So even if it is mixing well, you might not know that and might be suspicious of your conclusions. There's no free lunch, and VI has some limitations. One is the bias. Even if you solve this optimization problem, you don't recover the true posterior distribution. You recover an approximation to it, whereas MCMC is asymptotically exact. So that's a drawback. We can hope to make Q flexible so that it does pretty well, but that's it's a real limitation of VI. Another is that while we don't have to sample in variational inference, the optimization problems can be difficult that we're required to solve for variational inference. Here in the last line, so I now have the optimization problem in terms of something that's tractable, but we still have an expectation inside the objective function. That's not what you want to see ideally in an objective function. You'd prefer to see things that are more like minimize x squared, or maybe something slightly more difficult. But you'd prefer to see things that aren't that don't have integrals inside your objective function. You'd like something in closed form. It's not hopeless. It just makes it harder. Okay, so these are the drawbacks. At first, we tried both MCMC and variational inference. And these are just a high-level summary of our findings. We have a paper describing them in lots of depth. Basically, our findings were that the point estimates from VI and MCMC were similar in their accuracy for both simulated and real data. The simulated data comes from our model, so there's no model misspecification. And the point estimates are just if we report the mean. So we come up with not a probabilistic catalog, but maybe a map estimate or a mean estimate of the catalogs. And we find that both procedures perform similarly. We found that also on real data. And for real data, there's no known ground truth, but we use this one region of the sky known as stripe 82, which in SDSS is imaged many more times than other regions of the sky. With this particular region, we can use a catalog from the SDSS pipeline on on the co-added images as ground truth or as a surrogate for ground truth and use that to benchmark our algorithm on that data. And in that case, we also find that VI and MCMC for point estimates perform similarly. For simulated data, it's a different story though when it comes to looking at uncertainty quantification. VI, it's worse for uncertainty quantification on the simulated data. On the simulated data, MCMC is sort of asymptotically optimal. There's no model misspecification, and it does do measurably better than VI on the simulated data. On real data, though, it's a different story. On real data, there's model misspecification, and I guess the conclusion that we've reached is that the model misspecification is more severe on the real data than the error introduced by the choice of posterior approximation method. So in fact, we find that VI and MCMC, in terms of uncertainty quantification goodness, perform similarly on the real data. So trade-offs, but a strong case can be made for using VI for these data. It also is motivates work in improving the model, which is stuff I'll talk about in the next two sections of this talk, is how to make the model more expressive. This made it clear to me that a more accurate model would be necessary. In this case, our model of galaxies misfit particularly severely. Real galaxies, we modeled galaxies with a mixture of 14 bivariate normal distributions, which is a flexible distribution to some extent. I mean, it has tens of parameters, but galaxies have even more variety than that. So this motivated future work in improving the statistical model rather than improving the inference method. And it suggested that variational inference was pretty suitable for these data. In terms of runtime, though, there was no comparison. Our variational inference procedure, using much of the same code as the MCMC procedure, ran 1,000 times faster. So this test was done just with a small number of images to compare accuracy. We then wanted to scale it up to run on complete modern surveys. And so I'd say for large-scale cataloging, variational inference becomes a problem of distributed optimization. You have to solve that optimization problem that I showed you earlier using many nodes of a supercomputer. And so we developed such an algorithm. So it's a distributed optimization algorithm making use of block coordinate descent while different machines are working on different images, but still communicating when they share, when they have an image that for adjacent images. We deployed this on the Cori Phase 2 supercomputer at NERSC, at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. And our scaling results, sort of our headline results, were that in under 15 minutes, we were able to catalog the majority of the Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And we achieved petascale performance using the Julia programming language, which hadn't been achieved before, using, I guess, over 500,000 computer cores on the Cori supercomputer and 1.3 million threads. So lots of computation. And we worked with the creators of the Julia language on this. And this was a lot of fun to see the statistical model running on so many computers and to see such fast performance. So, okay, in terms of, I'll just sort of summarize what worked and what didn't to motivate the next topic. For the Celeste, we had a novel probabilistic formulation for cataloging. Our point estimates were state of the art by many comparisons in relation to the SDSS catalog from Photo. We had a real world comparison of VI and MCMC, which usually people don't bother to implement both and see which one works better. As of the time we did this large scale run, May 2017, it was the largest reported application of Bayesian inference in terms of the size of the data or the peak petaflops. It was the first Julia application to achieve petascale performance. And it was the first fully probabilistic catalog for a modern astronomical survey. So many things worked well here, but there were some pretty severe limitations also, I would say, of this previous work. The first one I sort of glossed over when telling you about the model, but I said there were capital S light sources. That capital S gets determined by a pre-processing routine. There's nothing statistical about the capital S. So we have a peak finding routine that finds individual light sources, and then the the approximate location of that light source is fixed during the duration of the optimization procedure. We'll adjust by up to half a pixel in each direction to improve the estimates, but the total number of light sources is fixed, and yet for many regions of the sky, the number of light sources is ambiguous, and it would be interesting to quantify that uncertainty. It would also be nice to do it all with one procedure trained end to end, rather than having a peak finding routine followed by a statistical model. The shapes of the galaxies we used were simplistic. The galaxies, yeah, as I said, were this mixture of normal distributions. And I found that to be a serious source of misfit for many galaxies in practice. The variational distribution we used was restrictive as well. I showed you that capital Q, and I said, the bigger you make it, the better it gets. We had to make a lot of approximations, and we had to really limit the size of the variational. We had to really constrain the variational distribution in order to make the optimization problem tractable, something that we could solve fast. And then finally, we were sort of boxed in with a particular statistical model because we made a lot of derivations and approximated integrals that were specific to the model that we proposed. It would be useful to be able to iterate and try different models quickly. We were boxed into a specific statistical model. Any change would have required both new code, but also new mathematical derivations of integrals. So Starnet addresses many of these limitations. This is the second work I want to talk about. This Starnet addresses many of these limitations for images of crowded starfields. And this is work that was led by Brian Liu, who's a tremendously talented PhD student at UC Berkeley. In this work, we focused on the globular cluster M2, a particular 100 by 100 pixel region. We had seen this region identified in Stefan's papers, in fact, and that's what I think that's what got us started on this problem. I think David was excited about Stefan's work and alerted us to his paper. And then we started working on the same region of the sky, but we wanted to try an approach based on variational inference. So this is M2, and there are 4 different boxes in red here. These are the boxes on the right-hand side. So we've zoomed in on the right so you can see what we're up against. I mean, it looks like a lot of the stars are in the center, but actually when you zoom out, they're just dimmer stars that are farther out. Here in the top left one, I mean, we're quite a ways from the center of the cluster, but we've got 5 different light sources, which you can see in the blue here. And it's very hard for a human to tell how many light sources there are. So we need sort of superhuman performance to do well at this problem, especially this one. I mean, look at all these light sources, how close they are together, where you can see that you can make out the individual pixels. And you see we even have multiple light sources in a single pixel in this case. You might wonder how we know where the blue dots, where the stars actually are. And that's because in this particular region, the Hubble image catalog gives us something that can stand in as ground truth, which is very useful for validating the algorithm, but not labels that we make use of explicitly, only for validation, not for training any algorithms. In addition to finding all the light sources, we would like to quantify the uncertainty because it's not going to be possible to find all the light sources here. In some cases, we're going to just have to, the best case is that we can admit that we don't know, or that we have several competing hypotheses. So for example, we might think of there being 3 different possible catalogs for this one image. In one case, it looks like we have 4 stars. This one has 5 stars with 3 closer together. And here we just have 3 stars. So different possible hypotheses or explanations of the data. Oh. Let's see. Okay, the advantage of a probabilistic approach is that it gives you multiple possible catalogs. So the model that we adopted was intentionally very similar to what previous papers have proposed, because we want to focus on inference in this one for this work. And also the model is quite reasonable. We think of the number of stars in a particular image as being Poisson distributed. And conditioning on the number of stars, we think of their centers as being uniformly distributed over the image, and the fluxes in a particular reference band as following a Pareto distribution, with some a truncated Pareto distribution with some lower bound on how bright the stars can be. The likelihood also is similar to the previous work. We think of the pixel values as Poisson distributed or the normal approximation to the Poisson, and we make use of the point spread function within the image, but we don't model the point spread function as variable yet. That's something we're working on. Across 100 by 100 image, I think it's pretty reasonable to think of the PSF as fixed. In previous work, Mcmc has been used to sample catalogs from the posterior, P of z given x. Recall z is all the latent variables put together and x is all the data. So previous work has used Mcmc for this small square, small 100 by 100 region here. One of the most competitive programs, PCAT, requires 30 minutes to process the region. And there's some earlier works that required a whole day to process this size of a region. 30 minutes is no problem for a 100 by 100 region, so it's certainly useful. But if we wanted to scale this to run on LSST, for example, it would be quite daunting. I guess to run on the full image at that rate, it would take 6 days. And to run at this rate, I mean, there are a lot of qualifications, I would say, but if you just sort of project out at this rate, it would take 71 million years to run on all of LSST. That said, we could use a lot more computers and we could probably speed up the code, but let's say it would be problematic. Okay, I do think it actually probably could be made to work with enough computational resources, but it would be nice to have a much faster approach and ideally one that would give better results too. So Starnet makes use of a particular algorithm called a particular type of variational inference called the wake-sleep algorithm. It's a little bit different than what I showed you before. It's more of a refinement than a change. The variational distribution, this capital Q family in this new algorithm is specified using a neural network. Rather than optimizing different parameters for every light source, so one parameter that encodes the center of the light source, instead our variational distribution is defined with a neural network that takes a subregion of the image and returns the parameters for any of the light sources in that subregion. So in this case, there are 2 light sources in the center. We push the whole image through a convolutional neural network, but in the square or in the position corresponding to this particular pixel or set of pixels, if we want to make them bigger, we would get back means and variances from the neural network for both of the light sources. The parameters, though, in the neural network are shared across all the different regions of the image. So if a new image comes along, we don't have to necessarily retrain the neural network. We just input the new data and we get out distributional parameters for any light sources that are in that part of the image. And so this is responsible for at least an order of magnitude speed up over the alternative, but potentially more than that. The second aspect of the wake-sleep algorithm, in addition to this, what we might call it amortized variational inference, because the parameters are shared across all the different light sources and all the different regions. It's amortized in that sense. This term appears in the machine learning literature a lot. Another aspect of this new algorithm is that we optimize a slightly different bound than what I showed you before. I showed you the Kale divergence between the approximation Q and the target distribution, P of z given x. In this objective function here that's used by the wake-sleep algorithm, the 2 terms are flipped. Kale divergence, it's like a distance metric, but it's not symmetric. That's one difference. And each of the 2 different Kale divergences, they're sometimes called forward and reverse Kale, they have different beneficial properties. In this case, when you substitute in this is called the forward Kale. When you use the forward Kale and you take an expectation with respect to data generated from the model, you're effectively training on simulated data, so data that's drawn from the generative model. That works quite well in this case because we can simulate very good images of stars. We know what a star looks like in a particular region from the PSF, and we can generate millions of images of different combinations of stars overlapping with each other. And so we now have an almost unlimited supply of training data. It's all dreamed up training data. That's why it's called sleep phase, because it's data that you dream up. The wake phase is where you observe the real world, and that wake phase is also important. But the sleep phase, we can make unlimited data And if our model's good, that's the big caveat, but if our model is good, then we can learn a lot from this synthetic data about how to back out the true parameters of stars when we only see images of them overlapping. In the wake phase, we update the parameters of our model, and there aren't too many parameters in our model. We learn a better estimate of the PSF, as well as a better estimate of the background brightness during the wake phase, but most of the heavy training goes on in the sleep phase, where we generate hundreds of thousands of images of stars overlapping with each other and learn to reconstruct the correct parameters for those stars. And I'm glossing over a lot of details here because I do want to get to the results, but that's the high level idea. I should also say that this is all stochastic optimization rather than deterministic optimization. So that slows us down, but we gain, there's a big speed up from only looking at subsets of the data for each iteration of the optimizer. So we computed some metrics. One metric we compute is the true positive rate. That's the recall. That's the number of stars that are matched with predicted stars. So matched from the Hubble catalog. And we call it a match if it's within half a pixel and the estimated flux is within half a magnitude. And then the counterpart to recall is precision, or the positive predictive value. That's the number of stars that we predicted that are matched with true stars in the Hubble catalog, divided by the number of predicted stars. So recall is what fraction of the true stars we successfully recovered, and then precision is of the stars we successfully recovered, how many should have we recovered, how many were good. And this is all computed on the same test data that I showed you earlier. So in this case, we compared to an old method called DAOFOT. It looks like from a couple decades ago, but it seemed like a pretty involved algorithmic approach to cataloging. We compared to PCAT, which is this probabilistic approach using a very similar statistical model to the one we're employing, but where inference is done using Mcmc rather than variational inference. We compared we have two versions of Starnet that we propose. One is trained with sleep-only updates. So there are no updates to the background brightness or to the point spread function. And then finally, we have Starnet Wake Sleep, which both uses the neural network to train on synthetic data, but also updates the point spread function and the background brightness to maximize likelihood in the wake phase. And so we compare them all in terms of true positive rate, recall and precision. F1 score is a single score that combines these two metrics. So Starnet Wake Sleep, I guess, gets a true positive rate of 51%. PCAT outperforms it, getting 56%. But in terms of precision, Starnet is at 61%, whereas PCAT is at 40%. When you combine the two to make a single F1 score, Starnet, both versions of Starnet are outperforming the alternatives, particularly the Wake Sleep version. To drill more down to those results, we see here the catalog from DAOFOT, here shown with magnitude of star on the x-axis. And so I guess this is just looking at the predictions. And in gray is the ground truth, or the Hubble catalog. So the Hubble catalog goes quite deep, finding stars all the way to 22 magnitude. DAOFOT, it looks like after about 19 magnitude, becomes hesitant to predict more stars because there's not enough signal and drops off. Starnet Wake Sleep, it performs similarly, but it goes up to about past 21 magnitude before its predictions start dropping off. And then PCAT, alternatively, I guess PCAT also looked pretty reasonable up to 21, but past 21 and a half or so started predicting a lot of extra stars for which there was no match. So that's one perspective on these numbers about why they might be different, is that PCAT is predicting a lot of very dim stars that do not match. DAOFOT is too conservative or is not able to detect some of these dimmer stars. And then Starnet is performing quite well up to 21 and a half and then dropping off. Concretely, we can also look at samples from the posterior to get something of a feel for how good the uncertainty quantification is in all these algorithms. The blue dots are again from the Hubble catalog, and the red dots are samples from the posterior distribution. So ideally, you'd like a lot of red dots clustered tightly around the blue ones. And it looks like Starnet is clustering points pretty tightly around a lot of the true ones. So sometimes, I mean, here it seems to miss one of the two stars, but compared to the alternatives, it's samples from the posterior are lying quite close to the true stars. And okay, in terms of runtime, I said that our nearest competitor, PCAT, takes 30 minutes, which improves on the runtime of a day for some of the earlier MCMC-based approaches for this 100 by 100 image. The Starnet runtime, it's more nuanced because Starnet has a training phase, whereas PCAT is only doing inference. Starnet first has to learn, has to train its neural network, and the neural network training takes about 10 minutes to do 200 epochs that we found this performed well. After the initial 10 minutes, we have to do 2 additional cycles, or we elect to do 2 additional cycles of the wake-sleep training. These cycles don't take as long because the initialization is already pretty close to the ground truth. So that takes us up to 12 minutes. But then at that point, the model's trained. And so at this point, predicting only takes 0.2 seconds. It's basically the time it takes to load from disk and run a single forward pass of a neural network on a GPU that's running at 1.5 gigahertz. So it probably could even be dropped down lower than 0.2 data seconds. It's mostly data loading time at this point. And so our sort of headline figure is that the VI approach in this case is 10,000 times faster than the MCMC approach at inference. So there are caveats to this, but we think that the inference runtime is probably most representative of the runtime that would be required to process a large data set like LSST. There are issues to be worked out to scale to apply it to regions that are different from where it's trained, but we think that this is an important number, the 10,000 times faster, and it is representative of the type of performance we could see on LSST. So this work is all described in a recent arXiv preprint that we wrote and went through the review with the LSST desk collaboration. So currently in submission. And then the final work that I just wanted to touch on briefly, I think I only have a couple minutes left, is called BLISS, or the Bayesian light source separator. And so I now have a research group at Michigan, and some of these are students that I'm working with. Ismael Mendoza is our lead author or lead developer on this work. Just doing an outstanding job moving this software forward. And Brian's still with us. So BLISS is a small extension conceptually from Starnet, but I think the results of the change could be quite impactful. Starnet only works for stars. With BLISS, we want it to work for galaxies too, so that it can catalog arbitrary images, not just crowded starfields. So we can get these same results for galaxies in LSST, or a mix of stars and galaxies in LSST. The galaxy model in BLISS is more complicated than what I used in Celeste, because you recall in Celeste, the model didn't fit very well. It was a mixture of these bivariate Gaussian densities, and though it had tens of parameters, it wasn't that flexible. In BLISS, we have a model instead with many thousands of parameters. And we can do that because by using the wake-sleep algorithm from Starnet, we're not constrained to solving integrals analytically anymore. We can do everything with stochastic approximations, and so there are no restrictions really on the types of models that we can propose. And so we elect to use a very flexible model that's called a variational autoencoder as the galaxy model that's plugged in within the larger Bayesian model. So the galaxy model is a sub-model that's connected to the larger model. The galaxy model is quite simple in terms of its probabilistic structure. There are just these latent variables z, low dimensional. You might think of there being 4. We use more than 4, but this is the rough idea. And then the data x given z is also normally distributed. The power of this model comes from the 2 neural networks there, which are encoded as f sub mu and f sub sigma. The neural network takes the low dimensional representation z. So you can think of it as like the kind of low dimensional representation you would get from PCA, but it's nonlinear. So that idea, this is a low dimensional representation of the galaxy. One neural network expands this to come up with an intensity for every pixel, which is the mean intensity. Another neural network, we share some layers with the first. They give an uncertainty for every pixel. And then finally, in this model, the galaxy is drawn from the normal distribution specified by this mean for each pixel and this standard deviation. So it's about a 2000 dimensional normal distribution here, with each pixel as one dimension. Yeah, very flexible model of galaxies. And it's not an obstacle because of how we're doing inference. It would have been with Celeste, which is why we had to do what we did. But with the new Starnet approach to training, we can plug in a more expressive galaxy model. We're getting pretty good results on data simulated from GalSim so far. We have 8 galaxies simulated here, and I think the red X is the prediction and the blue cross is the truth. We've simulated 8 galaxies, and Bliss has successfully recovered that there are 8 galaxies in this subregion of the image. Bliss is also, at the end of the day, it's an autoencoder, so it has an output that reconstructs the image, and the reconstruction matches quite closely. I think all the pixels are fewer than 3 standard deviations away, so it's fitting quite closely. This is all with simulated data. Results with SDSS and DC2 data are forthcoming. Bliss is being actively developed on GitHub out in the public. So you're welcome to try out our software or to get involved. And I think that's most of what I wanted to say about Bliss. I guess just to quickly summarize the contributions, I think I'm out of time. But so for Celeste, it was the first Julia application to achieve petascale performance. We constructed a catalog from SDSS in 15 minutes. And it's the first fully probabilistic catalog for a complete modern survey, although SDSS, one much smaller than LSST. Starnet then is the most accurate method for constructing probabilistic catalogs of crowded starfields, and orders of magnitude faster than approaches based on MCMC. And finally, Bliss extends Starnet with a highly flexible galaxy model, and it possesses the scaling characteristics to construct probabilistic catalogs for complete modern surveys, such as LSST. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for your attention.
All right, thanks a lot, Jeff. Let's thank our speaker for his talk today. And if anyone has questions, feel free to, oh, I see some hands raised already. I'll call on Andy.
Sorry, thanks, Jeff. That's a great talk. Have you looked at how well you reproduce the photometry, particularly thinking about some of the galaxies? Because as we know, it's not just the detection of the sources, it's also the extended photometry that we try to estimate.
Yeah, I think we haven't really looked too much at that yet because we're just trying to get things running right now. I'd say our catalog for galaxies is a little bit different than a traditional catalog. We don't store things like the angles or the effective radius or any of these properties. We have just latent random variables. So they're the latent random variables in our model. And from that, we can draw posterior samples and try to reconstruct interesting properties of the galaxies from those. But the work is really focused on, I guess, on deblending, on figuring out which pixel came from which galaxy. And it would have to be in post-processing where we start to analyze the galaxies. So that is something we're going to have to work on.
I mean, with your simulations and the fact that you can simulate, the fraction of each pixel coming from each source, it should be straightforward for you to apply the standard photometric, whether aperture or PSF fitting code, right?
Right. Yeah, I think it will be. We haven't tried that out yet, but that's a good that'd be a good way to assess error. That would be of more scientific relevance than just sort of whether we found the right number of light sources.
And then I think just to wrap up the question, I think what would be really interesting would be to look at some of the kind of the second moments for these distributions from the perspective of the weak lensing. It'd be really interesting to see how well you can actually recover the say the ellipticity of these sources.
Yeah, that'd be very interesting.
Thanks.
Any other questions?
I have another question if someone else doesn't have one.
I'll allow it.
Can you actually extend this to multi-band? And what would you actually have to know in order to do that?
Oh yeah, conceptually it's quite straightforward to extend it to multi-band. just because it's already sort of expressed as a forward model or a generative model. We already describe how it generates one band. So Celeste, the first work is a multi-band deblender or cataloger that makes use of both multiple bands from the same run cam column field, but if there's another run that intersects with a previous run, it can make use of both of the run camp calls and fields. With Bliss, we haven't done that yet. Actually, with Celeste, we pushed it even farther and started integrating multiple surveys. So we have SDSS and also decals integrated. But yeah, with Bliss, we haven't tried that yet, but that's definitely a direction we'd like to go, is to use multiple surveys in parallel and also multiple bands.
All right, any other questions? If no one else has one, maybe I'll close out with one of mine. So in the sleep phase of Starnet, I guess you're training on data generated by the generative model. How much do you worry about model misspecification? Like, it seems like you found in the Celeste comparison, like the error from model misspecification seemed to be like small enough to worry about. And so I could totally see the same thing being true in Starnet, but I guess, how much do you worry about model misspecification? Is that something to be worried about, or does it seem to be small enough to that it's handleable?
Yeah, I worry all the time about model misspecification. For Starnet in particular, I think it's relatively safe because the model of stars is so good, because the point spread function is pretty well known, at least for SDSS images. That said, we do manage to improve on the model. So it's not like if we do sleep phase only, we are completely limited by our initial model. With the wake phase, we can update the parameters or update the PSF and background brightnesses, which we think of as parameters of the model, and can hope to do better. That said, the wake sleep algorithm, it's been around for some time. It's not that new, but people have not shown a lot of theoretical results about the wake sleep algorithm. So I am interested in proving some things about its convergence or under the conditions under which it converges, because that concerns me. I know that if the initial model is pretty close to the truth, it empirically seems to do well, but I'd like to have guarantees, and I don't think we have those yet.
Thanks. Well, if there's no other questions, maybe I'll close out by just saying there's still some slots available on Jeff's schedule if you'd like to meet with him one-on-one or in small groups. So you can sign up on the Google Doc for that. But otherwise, let's thank our speaker again. And yeah, thank you so much for visiting. It's too bad that it has to be virtual, but still was interesting to have you.
It's been great. Thanks for inviting me.